Welcome to this month's top 3 Airchat discussions with Naval Ravikant.
I don't think it is a path-dependent history. In other words, I don't think that Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley because a set of magic events happen in Silicon Valley at a particular place in a particular time. Rather, I think it's driven by geography. Believe it or not, geography is destiny. Every major industry in the United States dominates a particular town, and the United States is the dominant empire of our age. So how does this capitalist empire divide up its cities? That's the question. The finance industry dominates New York. Yes, there are many other industries in New York, but New York is uniquely the financial capital of the United States, which is the capital of the world. So if New York were to stop being the financial capital of the United States, it would be extremely felt within New York. The rest of the New York industries would collapse because everything you see there from art and media and advertising, fashion, etc., all of these require a healthy financial industry. So in New York, finance dominates, and finance is New York, and New York is finance. So New York is taken. You cannot move the tech industry to New York, and I know people are trying, but it just disappears. There's too many other things to do. There are too many distractions, and you'll always be number 2. It's taken. Hollywood is older than the tech industry. So by the time the tech industry came along, Hollywood was taken. Los Angeles was taken. Los Angeles is dominated by Hollywood, and it is the cultural capital of the United States. It is where all the media and the memes are produced. So it is taken as well. Too bad, because it's a great piece of land. So you can't stick the tech industry in Hollywood. It would disappear into the greater mass of Hollywood, and tech would be second-class citizens. And the whole town caters towards Hollywood, so it wouldn't cater towards the needs of tech. Just like New York caters to finance, and it would not cater to the needs of the nerds in tech. The tech industry, when it was first being formed, you could argue was fairly mobile. There are many choices. So you can basically set up shop anywhere. You could set up shop in Seattle. You could set up shop in Portland. You could set up shop in Texas. You could set up shop in San Diego. You could set up shop in San Francisco. You could set up shop in Miami. You could set up shop in Chicago. You could set up shop in Boston. Why Silicon Valley? You could argue that it's because of universities and colleges and talent. But that's not true. The university college talent capital of the United States is actually in Boston. It's Massachusetts. Harvard is there. MIT is there. There are a number of universities there. The Ivy League is all up in the Northeast. It's only in the recent few decades that the talent has migrated west towards Berkeley, Stanford, and Caltech. You could argue that it's because of government support and spending, all the money that the government sank into semiconductors in the Bay Area. But that begs the question, why were the semiconductor companies in the Bay Area? I don't think it's as simple as government spending. San Diego is a huge beneficiary of government spending, and the government spending tends to go where the talent is. It's not usually the other way around. There are places like Los Alamos that never developed any significant tech talent after the Manhattan Project. There's also plenty of government spending and plenty of money in Texas, in Houston, in Dallas, in Austin, but you don't see the tech capital of the United States going there. So again, why San Francisco? I argue it's because of the nature of the workforce. The tech workforce, like them or not, these are the most wealthy and most creative individuals on the planet. They can earn from anywhere. Even though remote work is a more recent thing, nobody has been able to do remote work at all in the past. And to the extent that they ever have, it was because of tech. So the tech people are the only ones who are able to do remote work. They also can work in smaller teams, so they are more mobile. And these are very creative, very intelligent people. The best engineers in the world, you would hire them no matter where they choose to live. And I think this highly creative, highly paid workforce, highly talented, highly mobile, works in small teams and can work remote, wants to work in the best place in the world. Where is the best place in the world for them to work from that is not already taken? So I think it's natural for them to choose the San Francisco Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay Area is absolutely beautiful. If you actually look at the physicality of it, it's gorgeous. It has Mediterranean weather. Yes, people make fun of it for being cold, but it probably has the second best weather in the United States after Southern California. It's still in California, so you have access to things like Napa, Yosemite, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Simeon, Big Sur, and all kinds of gorgeous places. And the city itself is very beautiful if you're in one of the safer, cleaner parts. It's also on a coastline, which is important for all kinds of obvious reasons. It has great food supply from Napa. It has great water from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. It's not so big of a city that it's already taken over by another industry and you would just get lost in it. And it requires you to be quite wealthy if you want to live there. It's also full of creative people. A lot of the creative movements in the past, everything from the 60s cultural movements to many art movements and poetry movements, started in San Francisco. If you're in the South Bay, areas like Palo Alto, Los Altos, Saratoga, etc., these are some of the most beautiful places on earth. Gorgeous Mediterranean climes, rolling hills, near the water, incredibly safe, incredibly clean. What's the problem with them? They're very expensive. And why are they expensive? Simply because they're in high demand. They're great places to live. So my thesis is that the reason why the tech industry is in the Bay Area is because at the time the tech industry was forming, the key people who were forming it were wealthy, creative, capable, worked in small teams, and were remote. So they looked around and they said, what's the best part of the country to live in that isn't already taken over by somebody else? I'm not even sure they thought it through that explicitly, but they voted with their feet. And yes, once they'd gotten here, then path dependency took over. And of course, Stanford and Berkeley and Caltech helped. I'm not taking away from any of that, but I'm trying to explain why the Bay Area. I think at the time they had to make the move. These people picked the best piece of land that was available to them. It's possible that if they'd had to make the move in the 1920s or 30s, they might have picked Los Angeles before it was taken over by Hollywood. But that ship had sailed. For those of you curious about Seattle, the reason why it's a runner-up and has two amazing companies there, Amazon and Microsoft, is because it is also naturally beautiful and wasn't taken over. Unfortunately, the weather is just not up to par. If you're curious about Houston and Dallas and Austin, Houston and Dallas were already taken and Austin is landlocked. It does have a beautiful lake, but if you're going to pick the best place in the world to live, you want a coastline. If you're curious about Chicago, too cold and landlocked. If you're curious about Miami, it's because it's not actually that pleasant in the summer. The good weather months are only about 4 to 6 months, and it's dominated by, unfortunately, drug culture, and obviously has a rich history as being the second capital of Latin America. So it is already very, very culturally taken. Also keep in mind that highly creative people prefer to be in close proximity to each other. And believe it or not, San Francisco is the second densest city in the United States, second only to New York. So cities like Miami and Los Angeles that are spread out have a much harder time competing for talent. Does this mean that the tech industry will always stay in San Francisco? No. San Francisco is busy playing pluck the golden goose's feathers as far as we can go. However, if it were to disintegrate from here, my hope is that it would retreat to the internet and not to any single geographic location. Although the technology isn't quite there yet, but we're getting closer every day. This just seems hopelessly naive to me, the idea that we can do it with nation states and boundaries and land ownership and preventing one person from going to another person's land. Because these exact same arguments can be applied against owning anything, literally anything. And so then they also end up being used against the idea of creating anything, because if you create anything, it goes into the public domain. If I can say you're not allowed to own land because land is evil, then people will just reallocate resources elsewhere, for example, into companies. And people will say, well, you're not allowed to own companies either because that's the border and the resource of the company. So you're not allowed to own that either. So I feel like this kind of libertarianism is just naive leftism in disguise. This same argument arises in the context of georgism, the idea that land should not have private owners, but rather that it should be publicly auctioned off all the time, and then the benefits should go to the government coffers. But it treats land as some separate resource from all other resources like oil and companies and copper and machines and factories. In fact, it is nothing but Marxism in disguise. If you take away land ownership, then you also take away ownership of all private property. And if you would take away nation states, then you're taking away all collective ownership of people's private property, which means that they can't have their own distinct culture, they can't have their own distinct welfare state, they can't have their own distinct policies and laws, they cannot have their own distinct right to choose who they collaborate with. It just ends up a massive, ugly, useless free-for-all. Humans do cooperate. We band together. We band together with people who are like us, and we band together with people who agree with our principles, our laws, and our culture and our way of being. And the idea that we're going to just do away with that anytime in the next few thousand years, or maybe at least the next few hundred years, is, I think, patently ludicrous and just wishful thinking. I'm going to put in an argument I had made against georgism in a separate room, because I think you can just zoom out and apply that same argument to this idea that we shouldn't have borders or that we shouldn't have nation states which own land. I'm not trying to be combative. I just think that people who make these arguments are well-meaning libertarians who believe that we can all get along if everything was just negotiated through kind of peaceful interludes and peaceful negotiations. But the reality is, unless you have private ownership of land, you don't have any private property, and you have full-on communism. And if you do not have the right for people who have private ownership of land to get together and decide who can and can't be on their land and what the rules are on their land, which is basically what nation states essentially are, then yeah, you can't have any sort of a function cooperative human society. Georgism has one huge flaw. It seems to believe that humans who own land own it unfairly because they expropriated with guns or violence when they first got there, and now it's been entirely passed through inheritance. That may have been true when a land is first settled or colonized, but it is no longer true. Now land is a store of value. So if I make all of my money selling jelly beans or building hospitals, and then I go and buy land as a store of value, am I still a greedy landowner? Can you seize it from me? Or is it any different than seizing Bitcoin or my bank account? So if you dig a little further, and if you consider land just a store of value, then you will find that all Georgianism is two things. One, it is a way of taxing people who otherwise may hide their assets and be hard to tax, say in an age of intellectual property or crypto. And second, it is just Marxism in disguise. It is stealing the means of production. It is stealing the store of value. It is taking people's bank accounts and redistributing them. There is no difference between seizing somebody's land and seizing somebody's bank account, especially when both are being used as a store of value and are no longer inherited goods that were passed down from generation to generation for hundreds of years. I think a lot of talking about free will is semantic nonsense because it's a very poorly defined concept and means different things to different people. That said, it is entertaining anyway, so let's try. I'm not going to attempt to define it, but I'll make 3 observations about it, 2 of which are actually repeating what Lupulus already said in some of his Twitter threads, but I'll do it my own way. Firstly, I think free will emerges from the computational irreducibility of the universe. You don't know what's going to happen next in the universe without running the whole thing because it's computationally irreducible. So in a sense, free will emerges just from the fact that you can't predict what's going to happen. It's deterministic, but it's unpredictable at the same time. So any agent that has consciousness in such a system will experience free will. Secondly, there's the computational irreducibility of the agent themselves, which is my mind cannot model my entire mind-body system. It does not know what my mind-body system is going to do next because it just has a vague model of that system, which is far lower resolution than the system itself. So I don't know what I'm going to do next, and that is free will also. Thirdly, assigning other agents free will is a very useful concept because it allows us to judge and hold them responsible for their actions and therefore to interact with them and oppose them or cooperate with them. If we didn't assign you this concept of free will and you were simply an automaton, then we would not be able to, at the same level, morally judge you. So I think it's a very useful concept for society as well. Finally, this is by no means a proof, but I found in general that when a common sense concept collides with a very intellectualized and reductive take, generally it's a common sense concept that wins. Having recently spoken with Professor David Deutsch, I've also updated my view on this a little bit. I think that the discussion about free will has to take 2 other things into account. One is you have to operate at the higher level of explanation where you're talking about people's actions and what their consequences are, and not at the reductive level. You're not talking about particle collisions because not all great theories have to be reducible. Many of them, such as, for example, thermodynamics, only make sense when you're talking about systems, and free will is a concept that only makes sense when you're talking about systems and agents like humans. So when you operate at that level, the deterministic nature of the universe underneath does not matter. The other, even more important factor is creativity. Humans are creative creatures. We create knowledge ex nihilo, out of nothing. And so that knowledge that we create drives our actions. It doesn't come from observations and induction. It doesn't come from other people. It doesn't come from just looking at the existing world. It is new knowledge that is being created, and this knowledge drives our actions more than anything else. And so since we are free to create this knowledge, and we have no reductive theory of how we can create this knowledge otherwise, then it is intrinsic within us. And because we can create this knowledge, we have free will. As an aside, most of the reason why people say that there's no free will is because they say, well, everything is determined by particle collisions. And so, what agency do you actually have? Well, the problem with the particle collision statement is that theories that explain everything explain nothing. And you can't actually run that computation ever. So it's pointless to even talk about it. It's operating at the wrong level of explanation. You have to move to the level of explanation where the system that you're talking about exists. Humans and free will exist at a much higher level and cannot be reduced down to particle collisions. That is just, it's kind of its new version of Zeno's paradox, where when you start taking things down to tiny, tiny little places that don't actually make sense, you end up with nonsense results.